thank you all for attending this evening's event. I'd like to give a special thanks to the Institute for inviting me to present my work. I spent a highly profitable 2 weeks last summer researching materials in the Institute library, and it is indeed a treat to be back at the Anderson House. In fact, I mentioned to Andrew earlier that I have not presented in such a stately room before. And unless I'm invited to Versailles, I probably won't have the opportunity to do so again. I'm also grateful to the New York State Society of the Cincinnati for generously funding my library fellowship. And thanks also go to the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Association and the Westchester 250 Group for widely publicizing this event. Finally, I'd like to thank the Selkirk family and the individuals who have assisted with my research, most notably John Reese, Christopher Minty, and especially Robert Selig. So my talk today discusses the experiences of James Selkirk as he journeyed down the Chesapeake Bay in the summer of 1781 to join the French and American forces gathering to besiege the British Army at Yorktown. As a sergeant in the Second New York Regiment, Selkirk endured a 9-day journey covering a distance of some 270 miles from Fells Point in Baltimore, Maryland, to College Landing near Williamsburg, Virginia. For Selkirk, it proved an arduous and harrowing voyage that claimed the lives of 2 members of his company. Little information is known about the experiences of enlisted men in the Continental Army, and especially those serving in the New York Line, who made this journey on the Chesapeake Bay during the Yorktown campaign. So Selkirk's voyage merits our attention, as well as the notice of scholars of the Revolutionary War. As I will show, Selkirk's account both enriches and complicates our understandings of the troops who traveled to Yorktown via a series of interconnected land passages and waterways. Today, these travel routes pass through 9 states and comprise a national historic trail known as the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route. Before delving into Selkirk's voyage on the Chesapeake, let's first take a look at his personal life and his years of service on behalf of the Patriot cause. Selkirk was born in the fall of 1757 in Gatehouse-a-Fleet, a town located in Kirkcudbrightshire in the Scottish Lowlands. Selkirk's father died soon after his birth, and as a teenager, he apprenticed as a tailor. Seeking to make his fortune across the Atlantic, Selkirk immigrated to the province of New York in July 1774. Admittedly, we know little about Selkirk's early years in New York. He most likely resided in Galway and Argyll, communities located north of Albany. Similarly, we are uncertain how he earned his livelihood. In all likelihood, he plied his trade as a tailor or as a clerk or farm worker. Selkirk's arrival in New York coincided with a period of growing ferment between Britain and the North American colonies. When long-simmering conflict escalated into open warfare in April 1775, patriotic New Yorkers responded by forming the General Association. Those who joined this group signed a resolution, like the one shown here, whereby they pledged to defy the British government and follow the instructions issued by the Patriot-led assemblies. The General Association originated in New York City and mobilized popular support in dozens of other communities as it circulated throughout the province. In late May 1775, the General Association reached Lansingburg, a village located on the east bank of the Hudson River, some 12 miles north of Albany. Among the 50 names appearing on the Lansingburg document was our very own James Selkirk, who at the age of 17 probably ranked among the youngest of the signers. Less than a year later, Selkirk enlisted in the Continental Army. His decision to live as a professional soldier was undoubtedly influenced by both his patriotic leanings and his precarious socioeconomic status. Like many other young men recruited for the Continental Army, Selkirk came from a modest background and lacked the advantages of either family connections or landed property. With limited resources at his disposal, it therefore made sense for Selkirk to find a home in the Continental Army instead of a local militia unit. To be sure, he would be giving up a large degree of personal freedom, but in exchange, the military promised him steady work, wages, food, clothing, and accommodations, as well as the possibility of advancement in the ranks. I'll say more about Selkirk's military service in a moment. For now, suffice it to say that he held the rank of sergeant and for nearly 7 years served in 3 different corps: John Nicholson's regiment, James Livingston's battalion of forces, commonly referred to today as the 1st Canadian Regiment, and the Second New York Regiment, commanded by Philip Van Cortlandt. Near the end of the war, Selkirk was released from his military duties. He returned to the Upper Hudson Valley and married Elizabeth Henry. The couple settled in Rensselaer Manor and over the years raised 1 daughter and 8 sons. Selkirk supported his growing family through farming and tailoring. He was stricken with a bout of ill health in 1803 that left him in a weakened condition and prevented his performing strenuous labor. With a lighter workload, Selkirk was presented with an opportunity to undertake a project that had long eluded him. He could now devote his energies to writing a personal account of his experiences in the Continental Army. Selkirk was still engaged in editing this memoir when Congress passed the Revolutionary War Pension Act in March 1818. Selkirk successfully applied for a pension, and he received an annuity of $96. Sadly, his death in December 1820 precluded him from reaping these benefits beyond a short while. The service and sacrifice borne by Selkirk was not lost on later generations, particularly those Bethlehem residents who sought to preserve their local history. In the postbellum era, they approved the creation of the hamlet of Selkirk in recognition of his wartime service. And here on the map that we see on the left, we see the blue ribbon that is representing the Hudson River. And on the Hudson's west bank, we see the city of Albany at top. Let me try this pointer. Aha. So here's Albany, and then the town of Bethlehem below it. And then tucked in the corner, southeast corner of Bethlehem is Selkirk Hamlet. So we also see on screen the New York State historical marker that was installed in 2009, along with other local markers commemorating Selkirk's legacy. James Selkirk took an important step in crafting his own legacy when he commenced writing an account of his participation in the Revolutionary War. This memoir, which has remained in the possession of the Selkirk family, is an unbound and uncovered manuscript containing 242 pages and measuring 6¼ inches in width, 7¾ inches in height, and 3/4 of an inch in depth. Although we do not know whether Selkirk intended to publish his memoir when he began writing it in the early 1800s, we do know that between 1815 and 1820, Selkirk took steps that put his memoir on the path to publication. So what occurred during this 5-year period between 1815 and 1820 that prompted Selkirk to want to share his story with a broader audience and have it appear in print? I contend that his decision to publish the account was prompted by his efforts to secure a federal pension and the concurrent public debates on granting support to those who had served in the Revolutionary War. The passage of the Federal Pension Act in March 1818 was not a foregone conclusion. In the years preceding, politicians and private citizens had argued over the morality, legality, necessity, and viability of providing financial assistance to veterans. At this time, there was a growing public outcry over the plight of Revolutionary War veterans, many of whom were not only advanced in age, but were also socially marginalized and destitute. Even though Selkirk did not explicitly mention the pension issue in his memoir, it is clear nonetheless that he viewed his proposed book as a vehicle for shaping popular opinion and drawing attention to the sacrifices of fallen soldiers and the current hardships confronting his fellow veterans. In the memoir's preface, Selkirk explained that his work would educate members of the younger generation. He wrote, "I have thought a history of this kind would be both useful and interesting to the public, but more particularly to young men, who has had very little opportunity of informing themselves of the history of the Revolution. They sometimes meet with an old soldier that will tell them what he has seen and done and what he has suffered with many others through a long and arduous contest with the greatest power upon earth in order to procure the privileges that they now enjoy. But all the information they can receive through this channel comes far short of the whole." To help raise public awareness about veterans affairs, Selkirk transformed his memoir from an account of his personal experiences into a broader narrative of the Revolutionary era. In the printed sheet shown here, Selkirk described the scope and content of his proposed work and the terms of purchase via subscription. Selkirk notified readers that the published version would be titled "A New and Complete History of the American Revolution" and would be organized in 3 sections. The first section discussing his personal service in the conflict, and the second and third sections containing a general history of the war and the post-revolutionary settlement through Washington's presidency. In expanding his work for publication, Selkirk borrowed extensively from David Ramsey's 2-volume History of the American Revolution. In fact, over 85% of Selkirk's text consists of material taken directly from Ramsey's history. First printed in 1789, Ramsey's book provided a comprehensive narrative and analysis of the conflict and proved a highly popular work on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, time does not permit a discussion of how Selkirk incorporated Ramsey's history into his own writing. So I'll summarize by observing that his acts of textual borrowing constituted a literary practice that was common and accepted in the early Republic. Moreover, Selkirk's skillful textual borrowing and editing practices enabled him to assert his authority as a narrator of revolutionary history, which is a remarkable feat, considering his non-elite status as a tailor and yeoman farmer. And I will be glad to take questions on this issue in the discussion session that follows. Unfortunately, Selkirk died in 1820 amid his efforts at publication. So his manuscript memoir was not realized as a work in print. However, if he had been successful in publishing the memoir, James Selkirk would most likely be a household name today, or at least among history buffs. For Selkirk's memoir is exceedingly rare. It is one of the few examples and one of the earliest examples of a firsthand account produced by an enlisted man of his extended service in the Continental Army. Selkirk created his memoir as a faithful record of the drudgery, deprivation, and danger that he and his fellow soldiers faced. In covering these themes, Selkirk's wartime account shares much in common with a better-known memoir of another enlisted soldier, Joseph Plum Martin. Both men produced memoirs that are insightful, engaging, and filled with anecdotes of the war, centering on the themes of military discipline, ill health and infectious disease, the rigors of combat, unceasing hunger, fatiguing labor, exposure to inclement weather, and tense civilian-army relations. One critical difference, however, distinguishes the two accounts. Martin's work was published in 1830, and since its first appearance, it has been reprinted numerous times, including these editions from 1993 and 2010. Conversely, Selkirk's story, although transcribed, remains unpublished. My goal is to correct this situation by producing an annotated edition of Selkirk's memoir that will be accessible in printed and digital formats. So, having said all of this by way of introduction, let's now turn our attention to Selkirk's misadventures on the Chesapeake Bay. Selkirk's ordeal on the Chesapeake originated with plans laid by George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, who led the French Expeditionary Corps. In early July 1781, Washington and Rochambeau concentrated their forces around White Plains with the intent of launching a combined attack against the British forces commanded by Sir Henry Clinton, stationed in New York City. However, in mid-August, the Allied commanders shifted their focus southward when they learned that the French fleet of Francois Joseph Paul Comte de Grasse was sailing with reinforcements from the Caribbean to the Chesapeake. Washington and Rochambeau now devised a strategy for a joint strike against the British Army stationed in Yorktown under the command of Charles Cornwallis. The combined French and American forces, numbering some 7,600 men, embarked on a 400-mile trek through varying land and water routes to Virginia's tidewater. At the time of this expedition, Selkirk was serving with Samuel Treadwell Pell's company in the Second New York Regiment. Over 5 years of continuous service in the Continental Army had left Selkirk exhausted. Since his initial enlistment, he had marched several hundred miles, had fought in engagements at Saratoga, Rhode Island, and Springfield. He had endured the severe winter encampment at Morristown and survived a bout of dysentery and ague that kept him hospitalized for 6 to 7 months. Little did Selkirk know that he would soon add another grueling chapter to his wartime experiences. Early summer of 1781 found Selkirk's regiment scattered throughout New York's Mohawk Valley, with Captain Pell's company posted at Fort Herkimer. Colonel Van Cortlandt received orders in July to consolidate his regiment near Albany. Through August, his men awaited the construction of flatboats, which they would use as transports before delivering said boats to the main army. Selkirk enjoyed light duties and plentiful provisions while stationed in Albany, yet the good times would prove fleeting. By month's end, the Second New York was traveling from Albany to West Point and from thence to other points southward. When the regiment received orders to leave Albany, Selkirk delayed his departure as he was charged with performing guard duty over a band of prisoners. Selkirk's group trailed the regiment from Albany to Trenton and then continued on the Delaware River, eventually reaching Philadelphia, where it caught up and rejoined the Second New York. The regiment then proceeded to Head of Elk, Maryland, where it split up, with one group moving on land and the other taking water transport down the Elk River. Selkirk's company was among the former, marching overland across the Susquehanna River and coming to a halt in Baltimore, where it reunited with its parent regiment and brigade. The New York Brigade, comprising the 1st and 2nd New York regiments, set up camp on the outskirts of Baltimore on the high ground overlooking the city. The encampment site, known as Howard's Hill and identified by Selkirk as Howard's Farm, was situated on land owned by John Eager Howard, an officer in the Continental Line. Selkirk noted that while stationed on Howard's Hill, he and his fellow soldiers remained unaware of their intended destination. However, they probably did receive news of the recent engagement at the Battle of the Capes, where a French naval force under the command of de Grasse defeated the British fleet commanded by Admiral Thomas Graves, and thereby prevented the Royal Navy from either reinforcing or evacuating its troops stationed in Yorktown and Gloucester. Moreover, the New Yorkers were again on the move, having received orders on 17 September to march through town to Fells Point, a peninsula that served as a supply depot and shipping hub for the Continental Army. Fells Point now served as the site of embarkation for the entire New York Brigade. Up to 77 vessels waited in the harbor to transport the troops down the Chesapeake Bay. The assembled craft consisted of 57 double-masted schooners, 19 single-masted sloops, and 1 galley propelled by 24 oars. Carrying capacity varied greatly, ranging from the Baltimore, a ship-rigged galley built in 1777 that carried 128 tons of cargo, to the Hazard, a sloop that carried 10 tons. All told, most of these were smaller vessels, and their combined carrying capacity amounted to 2,236 tons. David Poe, the grandfather of famed literati Edgar Allan Poe, served as assistant deputy quartermaster for Baltimore. He procured the civilian vessels required for military transport. Using a system of impressment and payment, Poe hired out the vessels at a daily rate from local ship owners. We have documentation for roughly half of the 77 vessels that gathered in Baltimore Harbor, and these accounts show that Poe paid out a total of 7,530 pounds in hard currency. In addition to finding transport for the New York Brigade, Poe also was responsible for conveying a contingent of Rochambeau's troops down the Chesapeake. However, Poe's efforts in securing a safe passage for the French allies proved unsatisfactory. Before allowing any of his troops to embark, the senior French commander in Baltimore, Antoine Charles de Hoo, Baron de Viomenil, insisted on an inspection of the makeshift fleet assembled by Poe. Specifically, Viomenil ordered two of his subordinates to undertake a survey of the transports and determine the suitability of their accommodations and safety. The inspection occurred on 13 September. Colonel William de Dupont, one of the appointed officers, reported the results as follows. The Baron de Viomenil has judged it impossible to expose the troops to the torture of such discomfort and restraint for several days, and to the great risks we would run in these little boats, shamefully equipped in every respect. He has decided to march us overland. Whereas the French officers refused these craft, the American commanders deemed them safe and fit for water travel. Indeed, 4 days after the failed inspection, the New York Brigade arrived at Fells Point and went aboard these same vessels that had been rejected by their French allies. Selkirk, along with Pell's company and a handful of women who served as camp followers, boarded an unnamed schooner of roughly 30 tons. I have listed on screen 4 likely candidates for the schooner secured by David Poe that possibly carried Selkirk and his group. And to show you a schooner from this period, here is an image of the Hannah, a schooner of 78 tons that had more than double the carrying capacity of Selkirk's vessel. Selkirk embarked on the schooner for what he would later describe as a perilous voyage for our company. Even before this vessel left the dock at Fells Point, a serious and potentially deadly matter arose. A dispute developed between Captain Pell, who was Selkirk's commanding officer, and the sailing master, who was in charge of handling the schooner. Both men laid claim to the berth, that is, the sleeping place located in the master cabin. The sailing master threatened to abandon the schooner if he did not get his way. Yet Pell refused to back down and eventually won the coveted spot. Pell's victory, however, came at a steep price for all aboard. For when the schooner left Baltimore, it did so without its sailing master. Selkirk, however, did not feel alarmed. The schooner still had 2 seamen aboard, and Selkirk trusted that they would see to the safety of the vessel and its passengers. Even though these 2 sailors lacked expertise in navigation, Selkirk reasoned that they could keep in sight of other vessels and thereby follow the fleet to their destination. Unfortunately for all involved, Selkirk's confidence was misplaced. He soon learned that the crew members were not only inexperienced in seafaring, but both admitted that they were foreign to the region and unfamiliar with the local weather, winds, and waters. So, bereft of a sailing master and burdened with an incompetent crew, the schooner carrying Selkirk and company left the safety of Baltimore Harbor and set out on its voyage down the Chesapeake Bay. So for the following slides, I'll be using this 1776 map of the Chesapeake to reconstruct Selkirk's voyage. 2 caveats. First, I want to draw your attention to the fact that this map depicts the Chesapeake region flipped on its side 90 degrees. That is to say, north is over here. Oops, here we go. So this is what the map would look like if north was at the top. Bear this in mind when looking at subsequent slides. It takes a little getting used to. And second, in his memoir, Selkirk was imprecise in his description of times and dates, in his names of landscape and waterscape features, and in his calculations of distances traveled. So by extension, my representations on the map are likewise imprecise. Having said this, let me add that to improve the accuracy of my findings, I have supplemented my research of Selkirk's account with other contemporary documents, including letters, military reports, and especially 2 travel accounts produced by officers of the New York Brigade who sailed on different craft from Baltimore to College Landing, Virginia. The first day of Selkirk's voyage started easily enough. The schooner, along with the other vessels, left Baltimore Harbor without serious incident. Due to contrary winds, the fleet only sailed a few miles down the Patapsco River. The situation worsened the following day. That morning, Selkirk's schooner sailed with the fleet as it left the Patapsco River and entered Chesapeake Bay. However, soon after passing Annapolis, the schooner became separated from the other craft when it ran aground on either the eastern shore or Kent Island, depicted by the blue numeral 1. The ship's company eventually freed the schooner by throwing heavy materials overboard. But by the time they were ready to make sail, the rest of the fleet had moved on and was nowhere to be seen. To make matters worse, a severe storm came on in the evening, forcing the crew to secure the hatches and take down the sails. Selkirk reported that a sense of despair soon took hold of the ship's company, and he referred to what followed as, quote, a night of horror to all on board. The 2 sailors, along with the Army officers, abandoned the deck and spent the night shut up in the master cabin. Left leaderless, a few enlisted men formed a makeshift crew on deck and took turns manning the helm. Most of the company's men and women huddled below in the schooner's hold, where they spent the night crying, praying, and suffering from seasickness. When the men on deck sighted an island appearing in the distance, probably Poplar Island, they made for the safety of the western shore to avoid shipwreck. However, this course of action led the schooner to run aground a second time when it struck upon a rock or sandbar, as shown by blue numeral 2. This collision was so powerful that Selkirk felt certain of the vessel's destruction, stating, "It was surely split from stem to stern, and we must inevitably perish." Fortunately, the schooner was neither destroyed nor did it sustain serious damage. Instead, it was set free by the surging waters. Unfortunately, the ship's company fared much worse, suffering 2 fatalities that Selkirk attributed to either extreme fright or seasickness. The schooner and its company experienced 4 days of smoother sailing after the horrific night of 18 September. During this period, the vessel resumed its journey southward, sailing past the Patuxent, Potomac, Rappahannock, and York rivers, 4 tributaries that fed into Chesapeake Bay. On the morning of day 7, Selkirk and his shipmates found themselves in shallow water on the eastern shore, nearing Cape Charles and Cape Henry. They steered the schooner towards the western shore, where they saw from afar ship masts. They discovered that these were French ships of de Grasse's fleet lying near the mouth of the York River. The schooner attempted to approach these ships, but ran aground, and this was the third time for those of you keeping count. And the schooner was now stuck on a large sandbar known as the Horseshoe, which is right here. One of Selkirk's companions volunteered to take a small rowboat and seek assistance from the French ships. However, upon reaching them, the French sailors paid him no attention. In Selkirk's own words, they regarded him no more as if he had been a shellfish on the water. The French response was not due to rude behavior or a failure to communicate. Rather, they were busy handling their own problems. The evening previous, on 22 September, a British force led by Captain Thomas Simmons had employed 5 fire ships in an attack against the French craft stationed in the cove of the York River. Johann von Ewald, a Hessian officer commanding a Jaeger detachment, witnessed the battle and described it as follows. The sight was worth the trouble to see. The fire ships were set on fire and illuminated the area so brightly that we could easily detect the French ships at anchor in the very dark night. But since the fire ships had been ablaze too soon, the enemy ships cut their cables and sailed away. So these fire ships had failed in their mission. Although barely causing any damage, the British did force the French sailors to hurriedly move their ships upriver, and 2 had run aground in the confusion. From his stranded schooner, Selkirk could see the still burning debris of these British fire ships along the shoreline. And these are depicted by the fire emojis on the map. The situation among Selkirk's group grew ever more frantic as they sought to organize a rescue plan. They espied a sloop on an island located 2 miles away and developed a desperate scheme. Selkirk and 2 others removed their clothes and began swimming towards the sloop. Exhaustion overtook one swimmer who had to turn back. Selkirk and the other volunteer pressed on. Eventually, they reached shallow water, and through a combination of wading, swimming, and resting, they eventually reached the sloop. To their disappointment, they found that it was abandoned and located too far up on the beach to be set afloat. The pair returned to their schooner, still trapped on Horseshoe Sandbar. Spirits and morale were at their lowest ebb. Selkirk summed up the despairing situation by commenting, "Our difficulties increased. There appeared to be no end of them." Even so, a potential resolution appeared on the horizon. It took the form of a large schooner that was at anchor about a mile up the bay. Determined to make a final rescue attempt, Selkirk and a colleague once more took to the water. The bay was choppy, so this swim proved more difficult than the previous one. But finally, Selkirk caught a break. The sailors aboard the large schooner saw him and his friend in the water and sent out a rowboat to bring them in. Once aboard the large schooner, the pair received dry clothes, food, and drink. More importantly, the seamen promised that they would sail to the Horseshoe the next day and rescue the trapped company. True to their word, the sailors from the large schooner arrived on the morrow and freed the grounded vessel. However, they broke one of the schooner's 2 masts in the process. So Selkirk and his shipmates had to sail the dismasted schooner up the bay and locate a shipyard where their vessel could be refitted. Finding and fashioning a new mast took time. While waiting ashore, Selkirk's company fell in with a Frenchman who commanded a barge that was outfitted as a privateer. The barge captain offered the men a tempting deal. He wished to hire them for a night cruise to Gloucester aboard his 22-oared barge. Located on the north bank of the York River, across from Yorktown, Gloucester was garrisoned by British troops. And you can see that here. Those recruited for the privateering crew agreed to row the barge up the York River in search of British prizes and plunder. In exchange for their services aboard the barge, each man was promised a payment of 1 Spanish milled dollar. The captain, in turn, would command the barge and claim sole possession of any vessels and cargo captured during the cruise. Selkirk and the other New Yorkers anticipated a profitable venture, so they accepted the terms offered by the privateer captain. Admittedly, I use the term privateer loosely, for it is not clear whether this individual was authorized to engage in privateering and whether he had received a letter of marque or a letter of commission issued from state or continental authorities. Privateering was rampant on the Chesapeake Bay and practiced widely by both patriots and loyalists. Indeed, following de Grasse's victory at the Battle of the Capes, patriot privateering notably increased in the Chesapeake. Now, the image on screen is not a 22-oared barge. It depicts instead a 20-oared flat-bottom boat that was used in amphibious operations by the Royal Navy. But it is similar to the barge manned by Selkirk and his group. The night cruise and return trip aboard the privateering barge is depicted by the blue arrows. The barge traversed the bay, sailed up the York River, and hunted near Gloucester, finding nothing on water. The crew then went on shore and searched a few buildings. Again, they came up empty. The discontented captain and crew then ended the cruise and returned to land. In the morning, Selkirk and his companions went to the barge captain and demanded their payment. At first, he tried dissuading them and claimed that he owed them nothing since they had taken neither prizes, nor plunder, nor prisoners. When the New Yorkers pressed him, he confessed that he did not have the 22 Spanish milled dollars. He had only 8 of these dollars and offered them up in payment. This amount would not satisfy the crew members. After further negotiations, an arrangement was reached. The soldiers agreed that in exchange for their services aboard the privateer, the barge captain would give each of them $1,000 in Virginia currency. This was in the form of paper money, which was deemed far less valuable than specie. Selkirk felt cheated by this revised deal. Moreover, the barge captain had provided rum and cider to crew members during the night cruise, and he now deducted $175 from each man's payment to cover the cost of the alcohol. Selkirk further complained about the value of paper currency, commenting, "This state money at this time was little better than white paper." With the privateering business concluded and the schooner fitted out with a new mast, Selkirk and his group embarked on the final leg of the voyage. On 25 September, they entered the James River and sailed the final 40 miles to College Landing, Virginia. Upon disembarking from the schooner, the group made a quick march to Williamsburg, where they lodged for the night at the College of William and Mary. The next morning, the troops and camp followers of Captain Pell's company set off to reunite with the other companies of the Second New York Regiment and join the gathering French-American forces that would besiege Cornwallis's troops at Yorktown. Selkirk underwent more challenges as he participated in the siege. Located on the right flank of the Allied army, his regiment engaged in fatiguing labor, digging trenches, and building fortified positions. The surrender of the British forces on 19 October did not put an end to Selkirk's hardships. 11 days after this historic event, he and another soldier from the Second New York were court-martialed for stealing goods from a French officer's wagon. The charges, however, were dropped, and the pair were set free. If Selkirk had been found guilty, he almost certainly would have been sentenced to death. These events capped Selkirk's participation in the Yorktown campaign. So to conclude, what are we to make of James Selkirk's 9-day journey from Fells Point to College Landing? And what does this episode reveal about the Continental Army on campaign? For starters, it makes for a highly engaging story, one that recounts the travels and travails of Selkirk on the Chesapeake Bay. At the same time, Selkirk's journey provides insights into the collective yet little-known experiences of soldiers and camp followers who served in the New York Brigade. Here I have listed 6 other New Yorkers who sailed on the Chesapeake and who also wrote accounts in their memoirs, correspondence, orderly books, and pension applications. These accounts vary in length from a single sentence to multi-page travel logs and show that Selkirk's experiences was a shared one. At the same time, none of these other accounts can match the detailed and vivid description of Selkirk's narrative. Moreover, focusing on a smaller unit, such as Captain Pell's company, shows us the effects of wartime situations on an individual like Selkirk, while also shedding light on the dynamic of a unit's performance and cohesion under stress, and how its personnel interacted with one another. In adopting a small unit perspective, we also gain a much different understanding of how the events leading up to the siege of Yorktown unfolded in the summer and fall of 1781. Scholars have pointed out that the Yorktown campaign marked one of the largest and most successful movements of the Revolutionary War, and that it exemplified military excellence in such areas as logistics, route planning, combined operations, and inter-allied cooperation. While not disputing these claims, I contend that a different picture of the same campaign emerges into focus when adopting the viewpoint of Selkirk and his companions. Let's consider this issue by comparing these 2 maps that both represent the Chesapeake and the movements leading up to the siege of Yorktown. The map on the right shows the campaign from the theater operational level. It illustrates well-coordinated and efficient movements as carried out by the Allied armies and fleets that were ably led by their commanding generals and admirals. By contrast, the map on the left depicts Selkirk and his group on the Chesapeake Bay. They were on a schooner that lacked a sailing master and competent crew, and their journey to Yorktown included such dangers and delays as fatal storms, running down 3 times, a broken mast, and an episode of privateering. Theirs was not a textbook operation. In the words of Selkirk, theirs was a perilous voyage for our company. Thank you.
So we are going to do a quick Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you. If I could please ask you to wait for the microphone so our friends on Zoom can hear the question when it is asked. So any questions, anyone?
Yeah, thanks. It is interesting that an enlisted man got a countdown. How frequent was that by the time of the Civil War or even World War I that an enlisted man would be able to recount and then publish a history of his own experience?
Good question. I can't speak to the publishing aspect, but I do know that in later conflicts, such as you mentioned, the Civil War and the First World War, that it was much more common for enlisted men, the rank and file, to record their conflicts via diaries or write about them later on in memoirs. A few of these were indeed published. I think most of them would be published, however, much later on after the individuals had died.
There was something called, there used to be a series on the Civil War called Battles and Leaders of the Civil War that I think was written entirely by officers, and it was very famous after the war. I don't think had any enlisted people in it.
Yeah, I mean, now that I think about it, I know that there was Johnny Ransom, who was a prisoner in Andersonville, Georgia. He was a Northern soldier. He wrote an account that was published. And there are a few quite well-known memoirs and diaries, including a series of letters by, I believe his name is Chauncey Cook, who served in a Wisconsin regiment and served throughout the Civil War. His letters were published. I'm not sure exactly at what time, though.
Do you have any rough estimate of what portion of the citizens of the United States or even white citizens were literate during the Revolutionary War?
Good question. It really depends on factors such as region, socioeconomic status, gender, and enslaved or free status. Literacy rates did tend to be higher in the northern states, particularly among men. So in fact, some scholars have estimated that literacy rates for white males in the northern colonies / states were up to 70 to 90%. And of course, this was because of the Puritan religion. There was the focus on the ability to read the Bible. And also, just to follow up on that quickly, literacy itself, there were different definitions. So you might have some individuals who would be able to read, but then unable to write. And some individuals who might be able to write just their own names. And one thing interesting I want to mention about Selkirk's memoir is that when he wrote this, the copy that we have, there is no standard punctuation or spelling or capitalization. And in fact, there is almost no punctuation used throughout the work. And I think Selkirk, though, was fairly literate.
That's Latin we have as the
and one thing about Selkirk too is he was actually selected to serve as a clerk and to keep the orderly book for his officer when he was in the first unit, Nicholson's regiment. Now, Selkirk came down with an illness and could not perform these duties, but he was considered highly literate by his officers.
Hi. As you bring Selkirk's memoir to life, how are you approaching the parts that he did not write? And how do you know what he did and didn't write as you try to incorporate that?
Right. Good question. Basically, what I did is I took Selkirk's memoir and laid it side by side with Ramsey's history and went through every single sentence. And I've documented every single passage, sentence, phrase that he took from Ramsey's work. And let me say that Selkirk's editing and his textual borrowing, it wasn't a simple cut and paste job. Okay, there were sections like Selkirk, for instance. Selkirk had fought at both battles of Saratoga and at Yorktown, and in these sections, he incorporates his text within the Ramsey material so that the writing flows like a seamless narrative. And you can, in some cases, unless you have you're able to compare the two works, you can't tell where Selkirk's writing ends and Ramsey's begins. Okay? But again, as I mentioned, I think his decision to enlarge and expand his memoir into this general history had to do with the fact that he's trying to have the work published. So he's seeking to gain more readers, more subscribers to the work by offering not just this narrative of his own experiences in the war, but again, this general account of the entire conflict.
And you said that that was common during this time. Do you
Indeed.
think that had anything to do with his lack of being able to get the work published, or probably not?
Well, the reason I mention that is other historians of the American Revolution, including David Ramsey, regularly borrowed text from one another. So authors on both sides of the Atlantic, writing about not just the Revolutionary era, but historic events overall. It was quite common to use the work and emulate other authors of this period. In fact, it was seen the mark of an accomplished writer or scholar during this period was to show that you were well versed in the literature. And the way you did this was by, again, incorporating the writings, the texts of other well-known authors. So there was less emphasis on creativity and individual genius. And these acts of textual borrowing were not viewed as intellectual dishonesty or laziness on the mark of the writer. It showed that they knew their stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a quick question, hopefully, maybe. Do you know if there are or how many British enlisted men, kind of similar stories published? Are there similar to this?
Good question. There are actually quite a few. I don't have actual numbers, but I am almost positive that they actually outnumber the amount or the number of memoirs written by Patriot enlisted personnel. In fact, I've come across there is a memoir that was written a few years before Selkirk's work, and it also combined this British enlisted man, his own experiences with published sources. And one thing I'm looking into is it possible that this particular British work served as a model of sorts for Selkirk in his memoir? And one thing that I am researching at this moment is I'm looking at bookstores and libraries, both private and social and educational libraries to see whether this work that was published by the British soldier was actually available in the United States, whether it was commonly sold and read. So very possible.
Two questions. The first one is, what would have happened to the paper money? After so whatever, what was the, I guess, the currency situation? So that's one question. The second one is whether Selkirk and similarly situated people, would they have joined the revolution had it not been for financial dire straits?
A good question. So if I understand the first part, it is regarding the use of paper money. What did Selkirk do with the paper money? Or what?
$1,000 or whatever, like what would have, I mean, did that lose its value? Could he have used it? What would he have done with that money?
Yeah, he probably, I mean, one thing I know about Selkirk is throughout the memoir, he's always discussing how hungry he is, and his clothes are in tatters. And he also mentions that while marching, when going by a farm or other civilian property, he and his fellow soldiers would beg for food. And in many cases, it was not given freely. They would have to perform some service. And in one instance, he said that they actually literally sang for their supper. In other times, they had to pay for any food or refreshment that was provided. So I imagine, I mean, because after the Yorktown campaign, Selkirk does march north, that this money, at least while he's in Virginia, because it wouldn't have even been, I'm sure it wouldn't have even been accepted outside of the Commonwealth. He probably used it to obtain food and such. So the second part of your
Whether he would have joined the revolution had it not been for his financial difficulties.
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of scholars have pointed out that the young men and individuals who joined the Continental Army were normally the most socially marginalized and economically not well off. And these were the circumstances that led them to join the Army, to sign up for anywhere from 3 years to the duration of the war. With Selkirk, my thinking is that based on the fact that he had signed the General Association earlier in Lansingburg, that he was, in terms of his political outlook, he was a supporter of the patriotic cause. And I think it is reasonable, therefore, to say that patriotism, could have been a deciding factor. But as I mentioned in the paper, I don't think it was the only factor that drove him. That indeed, this is a young man. He doesn't, his family is mostly in Scotland. He doesn't have the social connections. He doesn't have landed property. So this as well, this precarious status, combined with his political views, would have led him to make this decision.
Yeah, I was wondering, in his memoir, does he express opinions, negative or positive, about leadership of the revolution? Beyond, I'm sure he makes a comment about the guy that argued with the captain about the bunk, but like, when he's hungry and when he's going through all these tough times, does he start complaining about Washington or somebody else? I was just wondering if he gave opinions about the leadership.
Yeah, personal opinions. I have not seen him express negative views of George Washington or the commanding generals in the Army. And indeed, the sections also that he incorporates from David Ramsey are also praiseworthy of the American commanders. So there is criticism of the government and also by extension, I think, of the military to the fact that Selkirk and the men in his company are normally, they are clad in rags. They don't have enough food to eat. He will, point this out and make, these general criticisms directed towards the institutions, but not towards specific officers.
This is a little bit more to your introduction, but you were talking about the push for a pension for veterans. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the context of that. Kind of, I'm assuming many of the soldiers were lower economic status after the revolution as well as before, but kind of what was going on in society that led to a push for this by the 18 teens?
Yeah, well, good question. And one thing I want to point out is that Selkirk, during his wartime service, very rarely received his payment and received his payment on time or at all. And this was recognized by the military high command and by the civilian governments as well. So by war's end, Selkirk and other soldiers of the New York Line and in the Continental Army also received a land bounty for their services. And Selkirk specifically received a bounty of 600 acres in the central military tract in New York State, which is roughly the area just south of the Finger Lakes. And what happens with Selkirk and most other soldiers, some officers as well as enlisted men, is they actually don't have the opportunity to go and settle on these lands. They end up normally, as soon as they receive this land bounty, is they sell it to speculators, to wealthier officers and other investors. And normally this land is sold at a fraction of the value. And this is the case with Selkirk. We have the records that he sold off this 600 acres. So he was, again, he came out of the Army fairly destitute. In fact, if I can share an anecdote that appears at the end of his memoir, when the Second New York is permanently furloughed in June 1783, the soldiers are there and they're, they look around and say, okay, what do we do now? Selkirk is in such dire straits that he goes up to his lieutenant colonel and says, sir, I have no money. I don't know how I'm going to get back to New York State. Are you able to offer me any assistance, provide any help in any way? And his lieutenant colonel says, Sergeant Selkirk, I'm very sorry. My situation is even worse than yours. I have a family to take care of who have been following me on campaign. I am also destitute. I don't know how I'm going to see to their welfare. So you mentioned specifically also in your question around the period of 1818, when the this public discussion regarding providing the veterans with a federal pension. So these debates that were going on, I think there was more attention to the plight of veterans. I think first in the aftermath of the War of 1812, which was with the Battle of New Orleans, was considered this great victory against Britain. It was in a sense, the Second American Revolution. And now the public starts paying more attention to the plight of Revolutionary War veterans themselves. Again, many of whom are advanced in age and many of whom are in a status of near poverty as well. So this is an ongoing debate that is going on. And the decision that is made is that this Continental Army veterans who can show, who at least show that they are in dire circumstances and who served for a certain number of years in the Continental Army. These are the veterans who are to receive pension benefits if their applications are successful. So initially, at least, most soldiers who are serving in other units, such as the militia or state levies, they aren't even able to apply for pensions until later on. And then in 1819, you have the country enter a period of depression. And at that point, you have politicians and Congress say, oh, we need to take another look at this pension program. Because there was, at the time that it was passed in March 1818, there was a belief that, oh, only a few veterans will actually apply for relief. When in actuality, you have thousands who are applying. And then there's a great fear that, oh no, we're going to bankrupt the Treasury, this pension program. But over time, over the decades, the pension program and who could apply for pensions expanded, not only among the base of veterans, surviving veterans, but also their wives and family members too.
Rob, I think we have time for one more question, and we'll take that from Zoom here. You are synced up pretty well with Zoom. People are asking the same question. So, but one viewer states most accounts focus on the siege of Yorktown. Selkirk, like a few others, illustrate the activities until the troops got there. And he would like to know, does Selkirk say anything about the days after the surrender?
The days after the surrender? Yes, he does. Selkirk mostly discusses at this point, the troops are marching northward and he and his regiment are given the responsibility for guarding prisoners and taking them on the march northward. That there isn't really that much more detail about their march into New Jersey. Then he picks it up with their encampment in Pompton, New Jersey, and he provides much more detail of the soldiers entering this cantonment during the winter and spring months.
Great, thank you very much. And I think that's a great place to wrap up. Rob, I want to thank you very much for making the trip down here to speak for us tonight. Great having you back here at Anderson House, as always. I want to thank all of you for attending in person, all of you attending online, and for your continued support of our mission. So get home safe, everybody. Stay cool out there.
Thank you.